The Malayan Emergency was a counter-insurgency operation beginning in June 1948 and ending in 1960 against independence movements in the former British colony of Malaya. Britain had underestimated the independence movement because they assumed that it was led by small disorganised groups of bandits that could be stamped out in a few years or so. Little did they know the scale of insurgency led by the Malayan National Liberation Army, the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party, to challenge the British authorities. Since Malaya was one of the most profitable territories of the British Empire because of their rubber plantations, the empire led a state of emergency responding to the insurgency. Welcome to Black British Hub, where I explore histories of the racialized peoples of Britain and the British Empire. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and keep notified. Malaya under British occupation constituted modern-day Malaysia and Singapore. The colony was formed from previous governmental states, sultanates and kingdoms on the Malay Peninsula. The first Europeans to make a colonial claim on Malaya were the Portuguese when they captured Malacca, but the Dutch East India Company and its allies pushed Portuguese from Malacca. The first English person to visit the region was an upper-class merchant named Ralph Fitch. He visited Burma and Malacca. Before that, he had visited India, the Levant and Mesopotamia, and he was one of the earliest travellers to visit the West Asian region. He was also a consultant to the British East India Company. He arrived in the Malayan area in the 16th century, but it wasn't until 1771 when the British became involved in Malay politics. The first possession in the peninsula they had was Penang, which the Sultan of Kedah granted to the British East India Company in 1786. Until 1867, it was known to the British as Prince of Wales Island. The 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty solved territorial disputes in Southeast Asia between Britain and the Netherlands, leading to the formation of British Malaya and Dutch East Indies. Those disputes had begun in the 17th century over clashes in possession. Signed on March 17, 1824, Netherlands ceded all its factories in India to Britain, withdrew their objections to the British occupation of Singapore, and ceded Malacca and all its dependencies to Britain. In return, Britain gave Netherlands the Indonesian islands. In 1826, the Straits settlements were created as British territories, which included Penang, Singapore, Malacca and Dingding. In 1886, Christmas Island and Cocos Island were added to the settlements. In 1857, the British established a trade-in post for immigrant miners, especially Chinese tin miners in Kuala Lumpur, which became the capital of the newly created Federated Malay States in 1896. The Federated Malay States included Selangor, Perak, Pahang and Negeri Sembilan. In 1881, North Borneo was established as a British protectorate. In the early 20th century, Britain expanded their influence in the Malay Peninsula, capturing 5 states known as the Unfederated Malay States, which included Johor, Kedah, Kelantan, Perlis, and Terengganu. During World War II, the situation dramatically changed. In 1941, Japan bombed Singapore and Kelantan's capital Kota Baru. Britain was unprepared for this assault and retreated from Singapore and parts of Malaya, in which the Japanese began occupying until the USA dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Upon the Japanese invasion of Malaya and before its occupation, Britain took the risk in training members of the Malayan Communist Party in guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. At the time, they were called the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army. The British had first released all left-wing political prisoners after the MCP offered military cooperation. 165 members were trained before British forces retreated. During the Japanese occupation, the Japanese created tactics to gain support from the Malays. They created propaganda campaigns through the media convincing the people that they were the saviours against British imperialism. The Japanese also recruited ethnic Malayan and Indian population to fight for the Japanese army. However, when it came to the Chinese population, the attitudes towards them were different. Because some of the Chinese population funded and supported nationalist and communist party efforts in China to fight against Japan, the Japanese launched a campaign to purge anti-Japanese sentiment in Singapore. Around 25,000 to 50,000 Chinese people were massacred, but the Japanese were not very bothered at identifying who was actually anti-Japanese and killed as many Chinese people as possible. This massacre is called Suk Ching, meaning purification through suffering. Moving on from this, when Japan retreated because of the atomic bombing, British forces regained control of the whole of Malaya. In 1946, the Malayan Union was created, integrating the federated Malay states, the unfederated Malay states, and Straits settlements under one administration. However, Singapore was not included in the Malayan Union and was made a crown colony itself. Sarawak was also ceded to Britain as a crown colony. The decision to create the Malayan Union was met with fierce opposition from the Malayan people because it involved reducing the rights of the sultans. Subsequently, the United Malays National Organisation, a Malay political association, was formed on May 10, 1946, to lead the opposition against the Malayan Union. The organisation was built on multiracial unity for a sovereign Malaya. The union lasted for 2 years, and in 1948 it was replaced by the Federation of Malaya. As the British drew up the constitution for the federation that would confirm Malay privileges, they made sure to keep 90% of Chinese Malays from citizenship, limiting their privileges even more. At the time, they made up 40% of Malaya's population. The political path for serious reform for the Chinese was blocked. The Malayan Emergency was declared on June 18, 1948, after 3 British planters were murdered in Sungai Siput on June 16th. However, something that needs to be noted is that the violence did not start there. It is often presented from the Western perspective that a senseless murder against 3 British businessmen is what provoked the uprising. It is, in many ways, portrayed as the main background for the Malayan Emergency. But the context for Sungai Siput is more than that. 3 years earlier, in October 1945, there were mass demonstrations of tens of thousands of unarmed people in the areas such as Ipoh and Batu Gajah. British troops repressed the crowds as they opened fire, directly killing 10 protesters in Sungai Siput and 3 more in Ipoh. In February 1946, they shot 15 unarmed protesters dead in Labis, Johor, and a few days later, they killed 5 more unarmed protesters in Mersing. They were protesting against the massacre in Labis. The emergency included outlawing all leftist parties, as well as conducting mass arrests for trade unionists and communists. Malayan Communist Party escaped to the jungles and formed the Malayan National Liberation Army, although the British called it the Malayan Races Liberation Army. The organisation served as the military arm of the Malayan Communist Party. The MNLA received widespread support from poor Chinese Malay peasants called squatters by the British, numbering to about 500,000. The reason for this was that Malay politicians had constantly threatened to evict them from their homes on the rubber planters to make way for replanting. MNLA tried to recruit from all ethnic groups, but membership was overwhelmingly Chinese. The British had presented this war as a struggle against communism during the Cold War, but while that may be a part of it, it wasn't the main reason, since the MNLA actually received little support from China or the Soviet Union. The main reason was to protect the rubber plantations. Malaya also had other multiple rich natural resources, including coal, bauxite, tungsten, gold, iron ore, manganese and tin. But it was rubber that earned planters the most money. Malaya was the world's top producer of rubber, accounting for 75% of the territory's income and its biggest employer. Tin accounted for 12 to 15% of the territory's income. Britain also became the first country to use Agent Orange on Malayan citizens. Agent Orange was a herbicide mixture which contained dioxin, a deadly contaminant. According to the World Health Organization, dioxins are a group of chemically related compounds that are persistent environmental pollutants. They are highly toxic and can cause reproductive and developmental problems, damage the immune system, interfere with hormones, and cause cancer. A few years later, the US military would use Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, with Vietnamese and Laotian citizens being infected. In 1950, a policy by the British called the Briggs Plan was introduced. It was conducted by Director of Operation Harold Briggs, who was in power of chemical warfare. Under his command, concentration camps were created. However, the British used another name, New Villages, to forcibly remove peasants, in which they called squatters, from their homes into another territory for supplying food to the Malayan Communist Party. Hundreds of thousands were affected by this policy. By the end of 1951, 500,000 people, including 400,000 Chinese civilians, resettled in 500 new villages. According to the National Army Museum, clean water, proper housing, education and medical care was provided. They also mentioned that many of the villages were surrounded by watchtowers and barbed wire, and the villagers' movements were strictly regulated. What's interesting to note about this is that there's no mention of the Orang Asli, an Aboriginal group in Malaya, who were also forcibly relocated to these villages. Some of MNLA's bases were in regions that the group lived in. The British believed that the Orang Asli also supported the Liberation Army. The transfer scheme only ended when many of the Orang Asli started to die of diseases whilst being in the villages. As many as 8,000 Aboriginals are thought to have died. In October 1951, the insurgents killed Sir Henry Gurney, who was the High Commissioner to Malaya. Subsequently, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister at the time, appointed Sir Gerald Templar, a former director of the military intelligence. Templar declared that the hardcore of armed communists in this country are fanatics and must be and will be exterminated. Thus, an extermination campaign was launched. Malaya was heavily bombed, with thousands of bombs up to 4,000 pounds were dropped. Britain also conducted 4,500 airstrikes in the first 5 years of the war. Military author Robert Jackson said one very viable weapon used by Britain was the 500-pound fragmentation bomb, the biggest of cluster bombs. However, it is not known how many civilians were killed in these attacks. The most infamous atrocity was committed at the village of Batang Kali, north of the capital Kuala Lumpur, in December 1948, when the British Army slaughtered 24 Chinese before burning the village. The British government initially claimed the villagers were guerrillas, and then that they were trying to escape, neither of which was true. A Scotland Yard inquiry into the massacre was called off by the Edward Heath government in 1970, and the full details have never been officially investigated. The British government still refuses to hold a public inquiry. Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper note that while Batang Kali was exceptional in the scale of killings, it was part of a continuing succession of killings on the estates, in the villages and along the roadsides. In the first 8 years of the emergency, 34,000 people were held in detention without trial. The Foreign Office said that detention rules covered people who are a menace to public security, but who cannot, because of insufficient evidence, be brought to trial. 15,000 people were also deported. Most were Chinese, so they were deported to China. The High Commissioner reasoned that their deportation would contribute more than other single factors to the disruption of the insurgency. Collective punishments were implemented in villages where the British thought the people there were aiding the insurgents. For example, in March 1952, at Tanjung Malim, Perak, Western Malaya, Sir Gerald Templar imposed a 22-hour house curfew, banned everyone from leaving the village, closed the schools, stopped bus services, and reduced rice rations for 20,000 people. The last measure was so bad that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine had to intervene by writing a letter to the Colonial Office stating that the chronically undernourished Malayan might not be able to survive, and also said the measure is bound to result in an increase not only of sickness but also of deaths, particularly amongst the mothers and very young children. Some people were fined for leaving their homes to use outside latrines, which is a structure usually consisting of a hole in the ground that's used as a toilet. In April 1952, the British communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, now known as the Morning Star, published a photograph of British Marines holding severed human heads. This was an attempt to change British opinion. At first, government spokespersons claimed the photographs were fake, and the Daily Worker in response released more similar photographs. The Colonial Secretary, Oliver Littleton, ended up confirming that these photos were in fact real. Actually, British and Commonwealth forces hired over 1,000 Iban people to act as jungle trackers of the MNLA. The Iban people, or the Sea Dayaks, are an Austronesian ethnic group originating from North Borneo who are known to have practiced headhunting in the past, although have kept their own cultures alive, such as the Iban language. They were hired as mercenaries to decapitate suspected MNLA members. When this practice was exposed to the public, the Foreign Office tried to deny it before they justified it. The Colonial Office privately said that there is no doubt under international law a similar case in wartime would be a war crime. Skull fragments were found to be displaced in a British regimental museum, while the British forces allowed Iban people to keep scalps as trophies. There were lots of propaganda by the British during this period. The very name of calling this an emergency instead of a war was one form of propaganda. Calling it a war would have made it very hard for British businessmen to claim insurance, and the government would have had to compensate those businesses instead for any damage. In addition, Robert Heatley Scott, Assistant Under Secretary of State at the Foreign Office, wrote about the insurgents in 1950. The decision to call them bandits or terrorists was taken originally because of the insurance implications of the words insurgents or rebels or enemy. It was only much later, when our propaganda machine began to get going in Southeast Asia, that the propaganda angle of the matter was ever considered. The Colonial Office's Assistant Secretary of State, J.D. Hyam, demanded, on no account should the term insurgent, which might suggest a genuine popular uprising, be used. Instead, the British would use terms like bandits or officially communist terrorists. On September 9, 1955, the government of the Federation of Malaya declared an amnesty to the insurgents, and a similar declaration was issued by the government of Singapore. The Amnesty Declaration iterated that those who surrender will not be prosecuted for any offence connected to the emergency before or on the date of the declaration, that local ceasefire will be arranged for those who wish to accept the offer, and that the government will investigate on those who surrender to make sure they are genuine loyalty to the government of Malaya and give up their communist activities and be reunited with their families. It also said their movements would be restricted, but if any of them wished to go to China, then their request would be considered. Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Chief Minister of Malaya at the time, said he would be willing to meet with the Secretary General of the Communists, Chin Peng, to explain more about the amnesty. Earlier on, Rahman also received a letter suggesting that if such a meeting took place, Sir Tan Cheng Lock, the president of the Malayan Chinese Association, would also attend. A meeting did take place. The Baling Talks were discussions held in northern Malaya on December 28 and 29, 1955, in an attempt to discuss terms for a truce from the Malayan Emergency. Attendees included Chin Peng, Rashid Maidin, a senior leader of the Communist Party, Chen Tian, the head of Communist Party's Central Propaganda Department, Tunku Abdul Rahman, Sir Tan Cheng Lock, and David Marshall, the Chief Minister of the Colony of Singapore. The talks were, however, unsuccessful because the communist representatives did not agree to the terms of the surrender. The position of the Malayan insurgents significantly weakened when Britain gave Malaya their independence on August 31st, 1957. A political alliance between the United Malay National Organization, Malayan Chinese Association, and the Malayan Indian Congress was created. Because the fighters' main objective had been achieved, many of them gave up, and the emergency was finally declared to be over. 6,710 insurgents were killed, 1,287 insurgents were captured, and 2,702 insurgents surrendered. 1,346 Malayan troops and police were killed, and 1,443 British personnel were also killed. 2,478 civilians were killed, and another 810 went missing. Many fighters, including their leader Chin Peng, were exiled to Thailand. The Malayan Emergency is also known as Britain's Vietnam, except Britain won.